Tessa holds a gun for the first time Montana territory. Spring of 1879 carried a kind of restless wind that slipped through the cottonwoods and tugged at Hem's hair and nerves. Just outside the small town of Red Bluff, the grove stood like a quiet boundary between the open prairie and the hills beyond. The smell of damp earth still lingered from an early morning rain, and the shadows beneath the trees were long and cool. Tessa fairly stood there, both feet planted, but knees locked, a shotgun cradled in her trembling hands. The barrel wavered by the smallest margin, but enough to make her jaw clench. Behind her, Gideon Zane shifted his weight in that unhurried way of his, like the wind was the only thing worth paying attention to. "You hold it like that again," he said, voice low but threaded with patience, "and it's going to jump right out of your hands." Tessa turned her head just enough to see him from the corner of her eye. He was sun-brown, the lines at the edges of his eyes cut deep from years spent squinting into the horizon. A faint scar ran under his left eye, more shadow than mark in the dim light. But it was his steady gaze that caught her, the same look that had made her trust him the first night he'd ridden into her life. He was a cattleman, a drifter by choice or by fate, with no home. Beyond the horse he rode the rifle at his back, and a past he kept sealed behind that still face. "I've never shot anything in my life," she admitted, feeling the truth in her throat like a stone. "Well," he said, glancing toward the open space between the trees, "now's the time. You said you wanted to learn." She swallowed hard. "I didn't think you'd take me seriously." "I always take people seriously when they've got a good reason to learn," he said. His eyes narrowed toward the tree line. "And you do." He was right. She had two reasons, Clara and Cole. For the first time in longer than she could name, Tessa felt something settle inside her. Not just safety, but strength. And it was hers. His brow furrowed slightly. "For what? For teaching me. For staying. For not treating me like I'm broken." He didn't hesitate. "You're not broken." The words settled somewhere deep in her chest, warmer than the stew had been, steadier than the cup in her hand. She didn't realize how much she'd needed to hear them until just then. The next morning, Gideon had her loading shells quick, moving between the porch rail and the fence post. By week's end, she could hit a rabbit at 30 paces without flinching. She cleaned the rifle in the evenings with the same care she brushed Clara's hair or washed the grit from Cole's scraped knees. It was no longer just about the shot, it was about what it meant, the confession on the porch. It was late when she found him still outside. The moon had risen clear and pale over the ridge, silvering the cottonwoods and turning the grass into a rippling sea of shadow. Gideon stood near the porch rail with his back to the stars, hands resting loose at his sides, gaze fixed somewhere beyond what she could see. Tessa stepped out, wrapping her shawl closer. "You're still up," she said. "Couldn't sleep," he replied without turning. "You think someone's out there?" She glanced toward the dark stretch of field. "No." He paused. "Just thinking." He finally looked at her, and in the dim light his expression had softened from the usual guarded lines. "You're getting good with the rifle." She gave a small smile. "I don't plan on needing to use it." "That's the trick of it," he said. "You learn so you don't have to." She stepped closer, feeling the boards creak under her bare feet. "Why are you really still here, Gideon?" For a moment, the only sound was the low rustle of the breeze moving through the grove. He didn't answer right away, as though weighing whether the truth was worth saying aloud. Then slowly, he reached for her hand. She let him. I think I stayed long enough to realize I don't want to leave. Her breath caught. I wasn't looking to settle, he went on. But then I saw the way you carry every burden like it's just another bucket of water. The way you fight without ever raising your voice. I never met a woman like you. Tessa looked down at their joined hands, her thumb brushing the rough skin of his knuckles. He gave a quiet, almost sheepish laugh. And now you can shoot better than me. That startled a laugh from her, too soft, surprised. He leaned his shoulder gently into hers. Now, when I'm old and useless, you can protect me. You're not useless, she said. Not yet, he agreed. But someday, she tilted her head toward him, the faint scent of wood smoke on his coat. Then I'll protect you. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her in a way that had no claim, only steadiness. For the first time in years, she felt what it was to be held without fear. Days of quiet. Living. The days that followed slipped into a rhythm so natural, it was almost frightening to her. Frightening because she didn't trust good things to last. Morning light spilled over the ridge, touching the roof with gold. Gideon rose early to mend fences or split wood, and Cole would tag along lugging nails or trying to hand him tools too big for his small hands. Clara stayed near Tessa, learning to sew a straight stitch on scraps of cloth, while the smell of bread or stew filled the cabin. They spoke of little things, when to plant, whether the goats would kid before summer, and left the heavier topics unspoken as if naming them might summon trouble. One crisp morning, Gideon came in with dirt on his hands and a grin that sat differently on his face, stretching into something rare. I found a spring, he said, clean and cold about a mile west. We could run a pipe out if we stay. The words hung there between them. If we stay. She tried to keep her voice even. If we stay, I want to. His tone was steady, not a question but a decision. Her fingers stilled on the bread dough. She looked up at him, searching his face for any flicker of uncertainty. She found none. I do too, she said. Something eased in his shoulders, and he reached for her hand across the table. The calluses on his palm were warm against her skin. They didn't speak much more about it that day, but there was a new weight to every chore, a quiet planning behind the way they worked together. Later that week, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the air cooled, he handed her the rifle again. "Show me," he said. She took it, feeling the smooth wood under her hands, aimed at the bottle he'd set on a post, and fired. Glass shattered, sparkling in the last light. He nodded once. "You're ready." She lowered the gun, smiling. "I'm not scared anymore." He stepped forward and cupped her face in both hands. "Neither am I." Then he kissed her, slow sure, like he had no doubt they were exactly where they were meant to be. Behind them the sky turned rose and gold, the land around them settling into the kind of quiet that promised something worth keeping. The feeling of safety. The first frost came earlier than anyone in Red Bluff expected. It skated over the cabin's window panes in delicate crystal veins, turning the glass into something that looked carved by hand. The fields beyond were brushed silver, every blade of grass holding its breath in the morning stillness. Tessa wrapped Clara and Cole in wool shawls before sending them out to gather kindling from the brush pile near the barn. They returned, with cheeks pink from the cold, and arms full, Cole dragging a crooked branch nearly twice his size, grinning as if he'd felled a tree himself. Out by the chopping block, Gideon was already at work. his breath curling into the air with each slow, steady swing of the axe. The collar of his coat was turned up, his gloves worn soft at the palms. Tessa stepped out onto the porch with a tin of biscuit dough, leaning against the rail to watch him. "You've got a rhythm to it," she said. He straightened, resting the axe against his thigh. "Like anything else," he replied, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "Learn it once it stays in your bones." She watched the next log split clean, the two halves falling away with a sound that was almost satisfying. "Do you ever miss the trail?" He paused, setting another log on the block. "Only on nights when everything's too quiet," he admitted. "But then I see what I've got here." He didn't look at her when he said it, but she felt the weight of the words all the same. Later, while the children napped under a patchwork quilt stitched from old shirts and flour sacks, Tessa worked in the kitchen, hanging bundles of thyme and wild mint from the rafters to dry. The warm scent of the herbs filled the small space, mingling with the faint smell of wood smoke. The door creaked open, and Gideon stepped inside, his arms full of burlap sacks. "I picked up some winter wheat seed from the storehouse in town," he said, setting them gently on the table. "Traded a few pelts." "You were gone half the day," she said, brushing her hands on her apron. "I stopped by the telegraph office," he replied. "Sent a message to an old friend near Helena. He knows a man who sells draft horses." Her brow lifted. "What for?" He rested a hand on the table, his gaze steady. "If we're going to plant something worth keeping, we'll need more than my back and a shovel." She didn't ask the questions that rose in her mind. "Are you planning to stay through spring, through next winter?" Because the answer was already in his expression. That evening, the four of them gathered near the hearth, the fire snapping and settling low. Cole curled against Tessa's side, thumb in his mouth, already drifting into sleep. Clara sat cross-legged on the floor, tracing shapes through the ash at the edge of the hearth. Gideon mended a strap on his saddlebag with a threaded needle, his fingers moving with quiet precision. "You ever been to Fort Benton?" Tessa asked. He nodded without looking up. "Drove cattle there once. Mud up to your knees come springtime. My father was stationed near there before the war." She hesitated. "You ever think about going back east?" Her head shook almost immediately. "There's nothing there for me now. Just gravestones and names I don't say out loud." He didn't press her. Instead, he set the saddlebag aside and leaned back as though listening to something beyond the walls. "I used to think I had to keep moving to outrun the worst parts," he said. "Turns out they just follow you quieter than horse hooves." She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. And now he met her gaze, then long and full. "Now I've got something worth stopping for." The words settled between them like embers, small, glowing, and impossible to ignore. Plans for the future. The snow thickened in the days that followed, not the deep trapping kind that locked the valley away from the world, but a constant drift that softened every sound. Gideon worked outside most mornings, moving hay to the goat shelter or checking the fence line for breaks. His coat was always dusted white, when he came in the cold, clinging to him like a second skin. Tessa kept the cabin warm with the stove burning steady, the windows fogged from the heat within. One morning, just after sunrise, she found him by the barn, crouched over something in the snow. When she stepped closer, she saw it was a length of pipe, its end wrapped in canvas. "The ground's soft enough now," he said, brushing frost from the metal. "I can start laying the line from the spring." She stood beside him watching as he measured the angle against the rise of the land. Clara wandered over scarf crooked around her neck and handed him a coil of cord. Cole followed, dragging a bucket of nails, nearly tipping with every step, but determined to help. By mid-morning, the four of them were working in a slow, easy rhythm. Gideon cleared brush with his axe. Tessa and Clara marked trees with strips of cloth, Cole announcing each nail he'd guarded like it was gold. They stopped beneath a cottonwood to rest the sun cresting the ridge in pale gold. "You ever think about what comes next?" Gideon asked her, leaning the axe against his shoulder. She rested a hand on Clara's small back. "I think about teaching them to read, about building a new root cellar before summer, about keeping the wolves away from the goats. That's next enough for me. I meant for us," he said. She looked past him toward the ridge, the sunlight catching on the snow there. "I've been someone's wife before," she said quietly. "I know what it costs when the wrong man is given that trust." "I'm not asking for promises today," Gideon said, "and I want you to have something that means I'm not going anywhere." Her throat tightened. "You already gave me that when you stayed." He cleared his throat, glancing toward the frost-laced window. "I figure come spring we could plant 2 rows of corn, maybe beans along the fence line, if you're willing to plan that far ahead with me." "I'm willing," she whispered. That night she pinned the brooch at her collar. They sat by the fire while he read from an old Bible Cole had found under the floorboards, the children drowsing against the warmth. His voice filled the small room, low and sure-steady in a way that anchored her more than she'd realized she needed. Outside the wind rattled the eaves, but inside the world felt still. By early April, the pipe from the spring was halfway laid, and every swing of Gideon's axe felt less like a temporary chore and more like the building of something meant to last. "They all think I'm broken," she murmured. No one who's seen what you've built could think that, Gideon said from behind her. She turned, searching his face. "You really think we can make this work?" He stepped forward, touching her cheek gently. "We already are." When she leaned into him, it was with no hesitation, only the quiet certainty that somehow they were already building a life meant to last. The air cooled the smell of wood smoke curling from the chimney. Gideon took her hand again. "I never thought I'd find this," he said. "Neither did I," she answered. "Maybe it waited for us." He kissed her hair, slow and certain, and she closed her eyes. In that stillness, with the land stretched wide around them and the promise of the years ahead, Sparrow Ridge felt entirely theirs. One evening, as they shelled peas on the porch, Gideon said, "There's a man coming from Helena next month. Brings books and paper through the valley twice a year. I told him you might want a few things." Tessa glanced up from her work. "You think of everything." "I think of you," he said simply. The words settled between them, the kind that didn't need to be answered right away. She reached over, resting her hand on his knee, and for a moment the only sound was the rustle of pea pods and the soft hum of Clara's song from inside. And in that moment, with the land they'd chosen beneath them and the home they'd built around them, she believed him completely. And she would answer, "We chose this because that was what mattered. Not that it had been given, not that it had been luck, but that they had built it plank by plank, season by season." The valley came to know Sparrow Ridge as a place where a man could get a fair trade, a child could learn, and a traveler might find a meal if they were honest about their hunger. People said Gideon Zane had settled there because of the land, But those who knew better understood it was Tessa, and those who knew her understood it was because of him, too. Years later, when the cottonwoods they had planted reached high enough to shade the porch in midsummer, and the children were grown enough to carry their own burdens into the world, the two of them would still be there side by side, steady as the ridge itself. They had built a life, not borrowed, not feared, but chosen, and it held always.